Hey, welcome. Welcome to another week of Bible Babble. Today's Monday, so it's Old Testament. And I'm glad you could make it. Looks like fall out there. So, last week we talked about how as the journey of the children of Israel was coming to an end, they had reached the land of milk and honey, and they were trying to get ready for what was to come. Because they knew they were not just going to be able to walk in and settle. That's not how things worked back then. It's not how things work now. You could not take a nation of people and have them walk into what is basically somebody else's territory and just say, all right, we're here, everybody else leave. It does happen sometimes in history, but it's never a peaceful thing. And even, 3,000 odd years ago, people knew that it was not going to be peaceful. But that was what was waiting for the Israelites at the end of their 40-year journey. So we know that they sent spies to evaluate the defenses of the city of Jericho, which was kind of the gateway to the land that they wanted. It was situated on the west bank, or the east side of the Jordan River. So if they were going to get into it's the west side, sorry. If they were going to get into the promised land, they were going to have to walk past it. And even if somehow some fantastical thing happened and they were able to walk past without being challenged by the people there, they were going to end up then having potential enemies behind them, cutting off their retreat, cutting off supplies, what have you. So it wasn't going to be good. So Joshua, who was now the guy in charge, sent spies to Jericho. They spied out the land, and they came back. And it was time for the Israelites to enter the land of milk and honey, and what eventually was going to be fighting their way in. But they had a barrier to cross first. They had to get across the Jordan River as a body of people. Sending a couple of spies into town, not a big deal. Sending a nation across the river, that was a bigger deal. Now, how many people are we talking? That's an interesting question. We don't really know. Based on the book of Exodus, as it's been translated by people for ages now, there were like 5 or 6, or I think 600,000 men in the group of Israelites. So you count women, you count kids, you're up into like the millions of people. And that number's probably not right. And it's not to say that the Bible is incorrect. It is to say we don't always know how to translate it. Because one of the words that is used in Exodus, the word is Aleph, and it can mean 1,000, but it can also mean a chief. So, and for reasons that probably made sense to them, the translators typically fell along the lines of translating that as 1,000 or the way they translated it, came out to 600,000 men. And probably they were really closer to like 6,000. Which is a pretty big difference. That's 1%. It's a 99% error. But when you think about it, when you think about what populations were back then, it probably makes more sense. Now, let's say they were right. Let's say the translations are right. You had this bunch of, millions and millions of people moving through the wilderness for 40 years. You'd expect them to leave more trace evidence of where they were. Think of the population of Wisconsin migrating somewhere. You need food, you need water, which were ongoing problems, but not to the extent maybe that we would expect. It's a really simple thing, but you'd expect, you have a problem with latrines. And that was a factor. There were actually written instructions in the Torah for what to do when you needed to use a latrine. And the answer was you went outside the camp, you took a stick along with your weapon, and you dug a little hole, and after you were done, you covered it up. And if you're talking some tens of thousands of people, that's one thing. It's a big deal, but it's one thing. If you're talking about millions, that gets to be a logistical problem. I read one commentary this past week that pointed out that to take millions of people and give them only about 1,000, any family give them about 1,000 square feet, you're talking about a camp that is miles on a side. So that if anybody wants to walk outside the camp and use a latrine, they've got a couple mile walk ahead of them. If you've ever been camping, you know that you probably really, it's not a desirable campsite if you have to walk several miles to get to a place to use the bathroom. So, I'm wandering off. How many people are we talking? Well, if there's actually the number of people that traditionally are considered to have participated in the Exodus, these millions of people, let's consider that, times are tough out in the wilderness. They may have lost half of them. Or they lost more than that and they just haven't replaced, at the rate you would think. So if you ended up with just let's just get wild here. 2.5 million people. If you line them up 10 across, you'd have 250,000 rows. Let's see, this is how you were going to march. You have 250,000 rows of people in the parade, in the column. If you're close enough to touch the person in front of you, that's a column that's 90 miles long. Think of a column of people 10 abreast from here to Madison. And you're in the ballpark anyway. So that would be a lot of people to move. That's another reason to think it was probably a much smaller number. But you still got to get them across the river. Some probably tens of thousands of people. How do you do that? The Jordan River, at the time they were there, this was in the spring, or actually it was at harvest time, I guess, tends to run at flood stage. which means you would be having X number of thousands of people swimming for their lives across the river. You're going to lose a lot of people. But think back to the Exodus itself, how it began. How did they get through either the Red Sea or the Reed Sea? Again, depending on your translation. It's a marshy area or a flat out, body of water. God made it possible for them to get through on dry land. Okay? So what happened here is that Joshua told his guys to go tell the people to get ready. Consecrate yourselves, he says, because we're going to be going into the promised land. And keep an eye out. And when you see the Ark of the Covenant go by, you need to follow it. That's going to be your signal. Again, this is another indication that we're not talking millions of people, because, the Ark of the Covenant would have to travel around quite a bit of territory in order to get everybody behind it. So, when you see the Ark of the Covenant, follow it. And then God told Joshua, and Joshua told people, in this case priests, that they needed to pick up the Ark of the Covenant and carry it toward the river. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, remember, is this, basically it's a box. It's a wooden box covered inside and out with gold. It's a little over 4 feet long and about 32 inches, something like that. Square, 32 inches across and deep and about 4 feet long. And it's got these poles so they can carry it without touching it. And that's important. We'll learn about that someday. So he told them, pick up the ark, walk to the river. And when you walk to the river, don't stop. Now, I'm sure the priest kind of, did one of these things. What did he say don't stop? Did he say that the giant gold box we're carrying is going to float? Well, no, he didn't say that. He just said don't stop. And again, keep in mind what happened in Egypt when they left. Long story short, they got to the river, and the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river. I was going to say stepped into the water, but not quite. Because as they got to the river, suddenly, upriver was blocked by something. A supernatural force. So the water that had been flowing from upriver stopped. The water that was there kept flowing downriver, and they had a dry space to walk through, just like happened when they were fleeing Egypt. Now this time, the guys carrying the Ark of the Covenant were part of the process, because Joshua said, when you get to the middle of the river, stop. And as long as you stand there, the river will have stopped as well. There will be a dry spot. So they did that. The people following along behind suddenly saw an opening so that they could pass through safely, and they flowed across. Thousands of them. We don't know how long it took. Now, one other instruction that Joshua had given is that each tribe, there are 12 tribes, he said, choose one man among you and tell them to stand by. So what happened is, after the people had crossed, these chosen men went into the riverbed, and each of them took a stone. They brought the stones back to the other side of the Jordan, the side they were going, headed to. And at Joshua's direction, they built an altar there, 12 stones, one to represent each tribe of Israel. And then the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, finished crossing, and all of a sudden the water began to flow from up north, and they had a river again. So God, as it's recorded in Torah, this is in Joshua 3, God kind of bookended their journey. In Egypt, as they were fleeing, they walked across dry land, miraculously. And in Canaan, the land of milk and honey, they walked across dry land, miraculously, to get home. And now, the children of Israel had crossed into what would be their homeland. But first they would have to fight for it. And first up was going to be the city of Jericho, a fortified city. And they were some thousands of people with nothing but what they could carry on their backs. How were they going to fight? And we'll find out that the next time we meet for Old Testament Monday. So have a great evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you here tomorrow for New Testament Tuesday. See you then.